Good evening. I'm Dr. Agatha Caraballo. Thank you for joining us this evening for the latest entry of the Civic Leadership and Service Series hosted by the Maurice A. Ferré Institute for Civic Leadership. I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the new Ferré Institute for Civic Leadership in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. The Ferré Institute's Civic Leadership and Service Series offers engaging discussions with public service leaders on the areas of civic engagement, leadership, community infrastructure, and social justice. We're very excited to be joined this evening with an esteemed panel of civic leaders from across the Puerto Rican diaspora. The diaspora refers to the dispersion of any people from their homeland. And tonight's panel is the first offering in our Puerto Rican and Puerto Rican diaspora programs, but certainly not the last. I would like to thank and acknowledge our event partners for this evening, the FIU's Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, Friends of Puerto Rico, and Cafe Ama. It is my privilege to introduce our incredible speakers for this evening. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Frances Colón. Dr. Frances Colón is the Senior Director of International Climate Policy at the Center for American Progress. She is the former Deputy Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, to the U.S. State Department, as a science diplomat in Washington, D.C., from 2006 to 2017, she promoted integration of science and technology into foreign policy dialogues, global advancement of women in science, and climate change policy for President Obama's Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas. Dr. Colón earned her PhD in neuroscience in 2004 from Brandeis University and her Bachelor of Science in Biology in 1997 from the University of Puerto Rico. She currently consults on evidence-based decision-making for governments and scientific civic engagement. I'd also like to just take this moment to congratulate her on her recent appointment to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and to thank her for her continued support of FIU and its leadership in transforming STEM education. Next, we have Ramon Cruz. Ramon Cruz serves as the president of the Sierra Club. He holds degrees from American University in Washington, D.C. and Princeton University in New Jersey. He has over 20 years of experience in advocacy at the intersection of sustainability, environmental and energy policy, urban planning, and climate change. He has worked as Deputy Director of the State Environmental Regulatory Agency in Puerto Rico and held senior positions at the Environmental Defense Fund, the Partnership for New York City, and the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. Next, we're excited to be joined by Marcos Vial, who is the Executive Director of Alianza, President of the Alianza Center. He is a political strategist and national leader of the Puerto Rican diaspora. Marcos has worked in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and several cities in Florida, as well as in Puerto Rico, where he has designed and implemented innovative, successful programs and campaigns in government, labor, and nonprofit settings. He has worked on civic engagement campaigns in Florida since 2011, focusing on the Puerto Rican and Hispanic community. And then last but not least, we have our very own FIU alum, William A. Ramos, who is a member of the Dean Advisory Board and adjunct lecturer at the Austin Marks School of Public and International Public Affairs at Baruch College in City University, New York. He is a governmental affairs expert with extensive experience in governmental relations, public policy, advocacy, and academia at the intersection of local, state, and national governmental and nonprofit organization levels, directly shaping and influencing the issues, policies, and systems that affect the nation. William was appointed by President Barack Obama as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, Office of the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce, promoting President Obama's America's Open for Business agenda, and was part of the key task force during President Obama's historic 2011 visit to Puerto Rico. William earned a Bachelor in Social Work at Florida International University in 1985 and was the president of FIU in DC's Alumni Network. He was born in Puerto Rico and raised in the Wynwood neighborhood of Miami, coming into the political, social, civic, and community conscience during Miami Mayor Maurice Ferré's era. Thank you all again for joining us, and welcome. I would like to start off a question that I'm going to pose to all of you and just invite you to chime in. Basically asking you, what does civic leadership look like? What are your thoughts on civic leadership and engagement, particularly within the context of the PR diaspora? And what does it look like, and how can we best promote it? Dr. Francis Colón, I'll go to you first.
Sure. I think for me, civic leadership has meant not standing in the sidelines when I felt that my voice was needed, even when it felt hard to do so. I think as a scientist in particular, in my field, doing the scientific work and getting engaged civically are seen as things that can be very time consuming and that are not necessarily intersecting. And it has taken my field a long time to evolve into thinking about civic science, leadership in community for science, science benefiting society. Even though it seems natural, it's not as natural in the actual making it work together. So for me, it has really meant overcoming that hurdle of taking science from the field and from the bench to really using it to help improve people's lives, and speaking up for science and for science-based decision-making and for truth and facts being the base of how we make our decisions from home to the White House, and standing up for that, at least for me as a scientist, that's what civic leadership has been about.
Awesome, thank you. Anybody else would like to join in next with their thoughts?
Having grown up in an era of the 1970s here in Miami, where the Puerto Rican community was beginning to exert a little bit of movement and action in terms of services that they wanted for themselves. I have my father's he's a retired chef, international chef, but a community activist, and my mom was an activist at church. Growing up in an environment where we were always challenging the powers that be in terms of providing services for a Puerto Rican community here in South Florida, mainly in the Wynwood neighborhood of Miami. Now it's gentrified and everything, but the reality is that this was the largest population of Puerto Ricans in the state of Florida for a long time. And those folks, like my father, are coming from the 1960s era of activism with the Young Lords in New York and Chicago and the other northeastern cities, where there was such a big movement, and Puerto Ricans started exerting that here in South Florida, which was a little bit different. Being here in the South back then, Miami was very black and white. It was, all of a sudden you've got a bunch of Puerto Ricans rallying, doing rally cries, and then the Cuban community starts coming in and exerting their political power as well. From my perspective, it comes from that era. I think, and I'll end with this. I was prior to all that other stuff in Washington, D.C. and being on the President's Task Force on Puerto Rico. I started my career as a director of Aspira Florida, which is a Puerto Rican youth organization whose purpose is to develop leadership among Puerto Rican youth, Latino, and youth of color through what was called the AAA system, awareness, analysis, and action. And we would make these students aware of what the issues were, help them analyze what it meant to them, and then take action on those particular issues. So from that perspective, working early with youth to do stuff is, I think, an important aspect of civic leadership. And that's why I think that the FIU Maurice Ferré Institute is very important, so that you can start getting the juices flowing in a lot of these students nowadays.
Awesome, thank you. And since you mentioned the big hubs, obviously New York and Chicago, and but now mentioning not only South Florida, but now Central Florida as well as a growing hub. Would you like to jump in on that, Marcos?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say it's such a huge privilege to be on this panel with such distinguished co-panelists. I feel like really excited and proud to be on this panel, and thank you for the opportunity. I think that, for me, it's something, the civic engagement or civic leadership is something that I always was part of in Puerto Rico. And when I moved to the United States when I was 14, I always thought I would go back and be civically engaged in Puerto Rico. And I've done that a couple of times, but most of my civic engagement or my civic leadership has been here in the United States, and where I earned my stripes, I would say, is in Chicago, this very fiery brand of activism where, everything goes. You go out and protest, you go out and mobilize people. We get in a bus and travel all the way from Chicago to DC or New York or wherever it is that we need to defend our Puerto Rican fight. And that's sort of the civic leadership that I developed in and grew in and earned my stripes, and always very connected to what was going on in Puerto Rico. And I think that a lot of people don't realize what huge victories the diaspora and the people of Puerto Rico have had during times like when Vieques was being bombed for 40 years, and the people eventually in Puerto Rico decided to camp out in the firing firings area, and then the diaspora here came out as well. And those are huge victories to be able to say that we were able in some way to impact the U.S. Army having to leave Vieques. That is an amazing victory. And it wasn't just people going out and protesting. It took a bunch of people inside government, outside of government, in communities across the United States, New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., here in Miami as well. And so to me, that's the background that I came out of and was privileged to be part of back in the 90s, the late 90s, and then moving into the electoral work, another area that for many years had been a very contentious situation for Puerto Rican communities in the United States, where you had growing populations in places like Chicago, even Cleveland, and different pockets throughout the country, and it was very difficult to win political position. And through voter registration at first, later getting people elected, and increasing the number of elected officials in our communities, and ultimately figuring out how to raise money and really put sophisticated PAC work together to move into places like Orlando, where it was frankly very difficult, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, to open into the political space. So it's a long trajectory, a lot of different types of activism and type of civic engagement or civic leadership, if you would. And I think that we pay attention a lot to the political leadership or the political civic leadership, but it's also like that in science and in politics and in government. And so I'm sure William and Francis would attest that they've had their own struggles within their own fields. And it's really an amazing thing to sit back and see that in so many different areas of impact, we have Puerto Ricans making a difference, and also still holding on and being worried and concerned about what's going on in Puerto Rico.
Awesome, thank you so much. Ramon?
Yeah. Well, in terms of thoughts of civic leadership, for me, it's more of a duty, I guess, or like, I guess in general, duty of citizens, or I guess not citizens, that's a more of a charged word. So more a duty to society, right? To give back and to be engaged in the society that one lives. And so I think early on, especially with my mother and other, mentors, I had that call early on, I think. But I was a big fan of social movements in Latin America, growing up in Puerto Rico, that had, I think, unfortunately, often that space was taken by political parties and, the civic space. However, we have seen that. I guess I came of age in the era of Vieques. And so, being arrested there, being part of the civil disobedience movement that Marcos mentioned, it was very special. And I think it's weird because in Puerto Rico, everything was so polarized, and things are, but I think there has been in the last decade or two, a movement towards the opposite, less polarization, probably because of the frustration with the government. But we saw it not only in Vieques, but in the, against Ricky Rosselló. At the same time, the same party was elected again. But, you had different voices from different places. And so I think there has been a depolarization, if you will, and especially with Hurricane Maria in between those two, a lot of autogestión, no, and more independence from the political parties. And it's funny because then in the diaspora are curious that in the US it's the opposite. There's a movement towards polarization and more identification with those parties that I saw before. But ultimately, there's a lot of space, of course, for the diaspora, by creating those bridges, those links that are so important that we have seen in all the movements with Maria that later on, we'll probably talk about and all that. So I'll stop there, but yeah, lots to talk about.
Dr. Caraballo, I want to add, not add, but complement what Dr. Colón mentioned earlier, how she took science and brought it into the civic engagement space. And what I've, over the years of working with Aspira and now as a professor at a university in New York, one of the conversations that I always have with students is that they're usually associating political activism with just politics. And what I always tell them is that if they find their passion in life, whether it be working with the elderly or on housing issues or on the environment or whatever, animals, there are policy issues within those different passions that they can follow that eventually will take them to political activism. It may be in a very specific space, but it's a space where it's important that Latinos are involved in, just as Dr. Colón is involved in the environmental space, which is very important to us. And then that opens her up to a whole host of other things. So working with students, I've seen that progression. And back in the 80s and 90s, when I was working with Aspira students and doing that, it was very rudimentary, making signs in our student center and the like. But now students can, through social media platforms, they can organize immediately and make a definite impact. Later on, I want to talk about the economic impact that then they help lead into political and civic service.
Awesome. I can already tell this is going to be an exciting conversation. And for those of you that may be joining and maybe aren't as familiar with the legacy of Mayor Ferré, Mayor Ferré was the first Hispanic mayor of a major American city and the first Puerto Rican born. So, I would love to hear your thoughts on terms of breaking down barriers and also the importance of representation.
Well, I was campaigning for Mayor Ferré since I was 5 years old here in Miami, door knocking with my father, who knew Mayor Ferré personally. And later when I was an adult, I was able to do things with him as well. And having grown up, not in Puerto Rico or in New York, but here in Miami, and having a Puerto Rican at the head of the city was always very impacting to me and gave me the yo puedo hacer eso, right? That aspiration that I can do that. And though I've never been elected, I've worked in the space. And I think that's important. And I think a lot of the same thing may be with Marcos and Ramon as well.
Yeah, the first time I ever voted, and sometimes I joke about this, Mr. Voter Registration, right? I was about 28 years old. So I wasn't so different than all of these people that we talk about and these apathetic Puerto Ricans. I was pretty apathetic about the electoral process. But when Luis Gutierrez ran for Congress in 1992, to me, the idea of having a Puerto Rican that would stand for, important things for the Latino community, not just for the Puerto Rican community. Obviously, I knew he would stand for, ending the bombing of Vieques. I knew that he would stand for many of the issues that we were fighting for in the neighborhood there in Humboldt Park. But to think that he'd have the opportunity to represent us in Congress, that was enough to say, you know what? Maybe I'm being a little bit, harsh here or a little bit rigid here, not thinking about the importance of voting. Let me go ahead and vote for him. And when I got into the voting booth and I voted for Luis Gutierrez, I then saw another name on there, Bill Clinton. And I said, oh, what the heck, I'll vote for him too. And then there was Senator Miguel del Valle. And I said, I'll vote for him too. And then I saw a bunch of other Hispanic names. And I said, I'll vote for these guys too. And that was my first election. I really wasn't your typical first-time voter that went and researched everything. I sort of walked in there with one purpose, that was to vote for Luis Gutierrez, and came out of there voting for several candidates. And ultimately, I never stopped after that. And it was really quite an emotional day. I went in there and my heart was pounding really hard because I said, my goodness, my vote is going to actually make a difference about who's going to be in power, who's going to make decisions. Not only am I voting for somebody, I'm voting against somebody too. So that was a pretty powerful moment for me, and it hooked me. After that, I became an activist for voting.
I had a similar experience in terms of going to vote here for the first time. When I first moved from Puerto Rico to the States, I moved to Boston to go to grad school. And I remember the first time I voted, I got really emotional. I was waiting in line and I couldn't believe how important that moment felt and just how much responsibility I felt just in that, standing in that line and in that act. So it does matter a lot. I think I'll speak about representation from the perspective of again, as a scientist, seeing Hispanic scientists excel has been very important for young people that want to choose these careers and that want to get involved. And in the climate movement, especially, people see it as the connection of science, environmental issues, and protecting their families, ensuring a future for communities, for the planet. And so I have to say, it's an honor for me to be the first Hispanic woman to serve on the President's Science Council, for sure. But when I wear that hat, when the announcement was about to be made, I knew that my community was gonna look at me, and that it was gonna mean something for them. The Hispanic community, the Puerto Rican community was gonna say, she's one of ours. And their eyes are on you, and it means something what you do with that opportunity and with that moment. And when the newspaper back home in Puerto Rico and Noelia asked me what mattered to me about how Puerto Rico could be impacted by that appointment, I talked about issues in Puerto Rico that I care about, and they're not a scientific experiment. It is actually a civic leadership issue. For example, one of the issues I mentioned was the austerity measures imposed on the University of Puerto Rico, where I went to undergrad. That's my alma mater. And it has been the axis of learning and economic progress for so many people on the island. And I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have attended grad school. I wouldn't have been prepared. I wouldn't be where I am right now without the University of Puerto Rico. So when the moment came for me to answer that question, I felt that was something I needed to put out front. And that is how I flex my civic leadership muscle, right? And say, I'm in this position now where what I say maybe has a little bit more weight than yesterday. I'm gonna use that moment to say something that will matter for the future of my community, for Puerto Rico, for the things that I grew up on that may be now under attack, right? And so I think that's what it means for me. Is representation is when that door is open for you, when you're in that platform and you have the opportunity, using it to flex that civic leadership muscle for your community.
Well, I would say, I mean, I had, of course, similar, experience to the ones expressed in terms of participating in electionary politics. And I guess, I remember going with my mother to a lot of like caravans in Puerto Rico, during election time. So I was actually, very motivated already. But I would say, in terms of, breaking down barriers, I think I'm within the environmental movement. That was a movement that, in general has been always identified with the progressive movement, but at the same time in the U.S. Has been a place where it's usually up till recently very much a white movement, white liberal, often suburban and wealthy. And it took a long time for people like me to be, in these organizations. And so in Sierra Club is actually a democratic organization. So the president is elected by, the membership all through the 64 chapters, over 1 million people can take part of it. And we have, almost 4 million supporters. So it was actually very big when and I was the first Latino. And so it's just important how, for civic leadership, and for civil society to also reflect the society that we live in. And therefore to have people like us and that look like the society that we live in also, at the helm of these organizations. So sometimes, when people talk about elections and breaking down barriers, etc., often we think of government, but all the civil society spaces and all the different fields and university, academia, faith organizations, etc., all of that is very important. And I think all of that is changing a lot. So, a lot of the future, will speak Spanish in this country, and hopefully more and more of the future will be female as well.
And if I could add to all of my colleagues here, Dr. Caraballo, I think it's important for this institute, as you start doing a lot of this with your students at FIU. One of the things that I did while I was in my 8 years at the Obama administration, and I was very conscientious about doing this, was that at every meeting that I was in, and those who have been in Washington know that these are huge conference rooms, I always made sure that I sat on the table, on the main table, because if it weren't most of the times that I was sitting at that table, there would be no Latinos at the table. And we all know the saying, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. So I wanted to make sure that I was ordering, right? And one of the other things that I did is, having worked with youth all of my life in leadership development and the like, I hosted about 25 interns from Baruch College and from the University of Puerto Rico. And most of them were Latino and students of color. And I made sure that I took them to every important meeting that I had at the White House, at FEMA, wherever it was, and give them real work, not just lazy intern work. I would give them projects where they were accountable in order to move the process forward. And for a lot of them, especially those that were from the University of Puerto Rico, because I was on the President's Task Force on Puerto Rico and chaired the Economic Development Committee for 8 years, I would give them the work for the task force. And they learned more about Puerto Rico during their internship than what they had learned at the University of Puerto Rico, only because we were giving them all the really good material. So as we grow, we need to also bring those folks up, because the young people are taking this over, and it's very fascinating to watch them how they move around.
Wonderful, and thank you all for everything that you do. In about 15 minutes, we'll be transitioning to the Q&A. So all of the attendees, if you have any questions, please post it in the Q&A function, and then we'll transition to answering those questions in just a little bit. So for the next question, because we had mentioned, obviously, community infrastructure and Hurricane Katrina, I'm going to ask, what are your thoughts on community infrastructure on the island, particularly following Hurricane Maria and the nature of support from across the diaspora?
If I may, I was living in Puerto Rico in 2017 when Maria hit the island. I was working as executive director for the Puerto Rico Association of Realtors. And one of the things that was very obvious to me when I went to work in Puerto Rico was the complete lack of information infrastructure that is needed in order to have a basic MLS system, for example, in any like we have in any other states or in many of the other countries in Latin America as well. So this information, the vacuum of information being shared from agency to agency, working with one agency or the other, was really dramatic. And I think that one of the things that we need to really address, and definitely after Maria, I mean, even more, is how we build that infrastructure back. And in all the aid and all the assistance that goes to Puerto Rico, if we don't build that information infrastructure, it's very difficult to be able to account for where that money is being spent. And one of the things that people always don't want to touch is the issue of corruption in Puerto Rico. But without the information infrastructure that you need in place, and instead of hoarding it agency to agency, sharing that information among agencies, that it be available to the public as well. Transparency is another important issue. The problem of corruption is going to continue in Puerto Rico, and problems, big problems like Maria or small problems, become really difficult to address.
Go ahead, Ramon. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks, William. You know, in terms of, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned Hurricane Katrina, but it was Hurricane Maria that you meant, no? Dr. Caraballo. But yeah, you know, I would say that the role of the diaspora at that moment was actually very unique and very critical. Sometimes, especially when the whole system collapsed in Puerto Rico, and sometimes you could get much more news, you know, people from Puerto Rico even calling their relatives in the diaspora. You know, in terms of the Sierra Club, it was one of the first times that we opened up, you know, fundraising channels from, instead of, you know, stopping our fundraising for a couple of days, you know, and then channeling everything directly to Puerto Rican organizations. And it was the movement was huge. It was, I mean, in terms of, for our size, you know, I think that the day in our history that where we had raised more funding was the day after Trump was elected. But that was only actually passed by when we opened up for fundraising for Hurricane Maria. And that was very important, you know, and we were able to send you know, that funding to over 30 organizations within months of it. That made a big difference. Now, something that it's important, I think, you know, especially when civil society organizations from the diaspora go to Puerto Rico, is that you know, the same way that we don't like to be colonized or told what to do, you know, you have to come to with a certain respect to the local places, and not thinking that because you're coming with you know, a relative wealth or you know, knowledge, etc., that you just parachute there and try to intervene. And that's something, I mean, that of course the Sierra Club is not the best example. Having been around for 130 years, we have done you know, some harm as well in different communities that we have intervened. I think in the nearly a decade now, we have adopted the HEMES principles for democratic organizing as our methodology, where you arrive into a place when you're asked to join, and you go in a spirit of collaboration and partnership. And so that is actually very important, because sometimes we think, especially us Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, go to Puerto Rico thinking like, well, this is my place, and no, I mean, it's also, you have to go with that spirit of collaboration and equality, rather than thinking that we have all the answers. And so that's important, because I have seen it sometimes, being in Puerto Rico and people going there, and local people sometimes can resent that as well.
Mm-hmm. Having chaired the Economic Development Committee for President Obama's task force on Puerto Rico for 8 years, I have a lot of stories and frustrations as it relates to infrastructure. I had the honor to go with Dr. Francis Colón with President Obama. Went to Puerto Rico and I hosted a White House Business Roundtable with the top business leaders in Puerto Rico. The following day, I did an economic development summit with over 200 business leaders, political leaders, academia, nonprofit stakeholders. And you hear everyone wants the same thing. They want great infrastructure. They want great services in Puerto Rico. And Marco touched upon on the corruption, but I'll also, even if it's not corruption, the status issue of Puerto Rico stops Puerto Rico from moving forward on a whole host of stuff, right? And I could give you an example. We worked on trying to turn over to the Puerto Rico government the Ceiba naval base that has taken forever. And working with our economic development partners at the Defense Department, they would tell me, usually it takes us a turnaround about 1.5 years to turn over a base to a community, to a city, to a state. And we've been working on this with Puerto Rico for about 9 years, because every time there's a new government from a different party, the plan changes, right? So when the plan changes, because that party didn't have a good plan, we're going to start all over again. And it just becomes self-perpetuating that we're never going to get this done. So I dealt with those frustrations constantly in Puerto Rico. And whereas here in the United States, yes, we have elections, the political appointees move on, but the career folks stay, and they keep moving the ball on major projects. The new politicals come in with their policy prescriptions and ideas, and they work on those as well. But everything is not shelved. So we would go in there, Ramon, with that humility that we needed to go into Puerto Rico and say, hey, we're not trying to convert everything from our perspective, but you guys have to move this ball forward so that we can come in with the money and the resources and all that good stuff. And that was always very frustrating. I loved working with them all, had a great time, but would have to deal with that frustration. And as one of the few Puerto Ricans at the Department of Commerce who actually had any pull, I always then had to deal with my colleagues like, what's going on? Why can't we move this in Puerto Rico? And so I would have to go through the whole explanation of status and all that good stuff. So that was my piece there. I went on a rant, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that my thoughts on and we're talking about hard infrastructure, right? We're talking about actual roads and grids, or are we talking about the human infrastructure?
It can be all of the above.
So I'll say this. I think one of the most frustrating parts of trying to rebuild after Hurricane Maria was the barriers that were built into the system on the federal level. And one of those things was, for example, the idea that things cannot be rebuilt better. They can only be rebuilt according to regulation to the state in which they were in when the disaster happened. And those are rules that govern how FEMA funds are used. And imagine in a world where we have the challenge of climate change, where we had an electrical grid that was not adequate for the needs of the population at the moment in which it came down, much less for the predicted impacts of climate change that will come to Puerto Rico, and having and be beholden to these antiquated rules as to how Puerto Rico was going to rebuild and move forward. That and many other systemic barriers and obstacles to getting the resources to flow to really get the island back on its feet. And I can tell you that how many years have passed now? And we are talking about a fraction of the resources that were intended for the rebuilding have made it. The vast majority has not. And so I think it's very frustrating. But I think the silver lining in all of this has been the resilience of the Puerto Rican community, and how they have not stood by and waited for this, but have found ways to rebuild, have demonstrated that they believe in Puerto Rico, they believe in the future of the island, they believe that they can overcome. And many people have worked very, very hard to stand up what I call a human community infrastructure, rebuilding, but rebuilding also a civil society, creating organizations, creating movements, and doing things that we hadn't seen happen for a really long time. And you know, I think you can very much credit that rebirth of civil society infrastructure with what happened with the protests that summer on the ouster of the governor. You can trace it back to the heightened awareness and consciousness of the people, to the power of their voice and their resilience.
Looking on the bright side, and of course, focusing on empowerment, I would like you to ask, what advice do you have for those that are hoping to affect change in their communities, and perhaps to students seeking careers in service?
Should I go first since I went last? Before Willie takes the mic. I'm just kidding. I love you, Willie. I think that everybody can be an agent of change from wherever they are with whatever they have. Whether you're a student in undergrad, whether you're in grad school, whether you're in the workforce, it doesn't matter. We all have something to contribute, and we can all be a part of how we move things forward. I really believe that. For me, the tool has been civic science, has been policy, involvement in using science to shape policy, has been here in Florida, getting involved in building a Puerto Rican movement. Those are my tools, because this is where I am in this community, with my background as a Puerto Rican scientist woman. So I'm flexing my civic leadership muscle in the platforms that I have access to, and making sure that I'm opening doors for others, and creating opportunity. I think that anybody can do that from wherever they are. And so that would be my advice. Get involved. No time for sidelines. The moment is now.
Wow, Francis, that is a very powerful statement. I love it. And I think that there is no better time for those who want to be involved than now. I think Maria changed a lot of things for Puerto Ricans. 2/3 of us now living in the United States, 1/3 living in the island, approximately. And certainly Maria activated and brought the best out of all of us in the island, and also here in the diaspora. What a powerful movement was born right after Maria, of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and others and friends, right, of Puerto Rico in the United States, working hard to provide the assistance and the help that, you know, sadly was not coming through the appropriate channels. And so I think that one of the big lasting impacts of Maria has been that Puerto Ricans know each other better than they did before Maria. Puerto Ricans in the diaspora connected with Puerto Ricans in the island. Puerto Ricans across the diaspora connected with each other. And in Florida, for example, where I traveled soon after Maria and founded the organizations of Alianza, we found a community that was ripe to make a huge difference, and we've done it. And curiously, Francis, one of the things that has happened in Florida that's different than it happens in other, what would you call it, like Renaissance moments in Puerto Rican communities in the North, is that more women are entering politics and are entering leadership than in any other diaspora city in their relative time, right? When they were in the rise in New York, or when it was in the rise in Chicago or Philadelphia, it was mostly a male-dominated rise. And here in Florida, we're seeing at least half of the women elected, and in every business and in every realm, women standing up and owning that leadership. And so that's a very exciting phenomenon that's unique to Florida in the sense, if you compare it historically to others, but it's also maybe the moment. Anyway, I think it's the right moment for people to really become civic active. Our experiences recently have sort of forced us to sort of, they shake the tree and we come down and meet each other under the tree.
Among the Puerto Rican students that I mentored during my time at Commerce, and they would come through the Arturo Carrion program, and I forget the other program, Francis, if you can jog my memory. There are 2 internship programs from Puerto Rico that come to Washington, D.C., and we would bring them into the Department of Commerce and, what the department and all that good does. We do the whole presentation, and we get into answering questions, question and answer moments with them. And every group always asks, how can change happen in Puerto Rico? And my response to them was always, change in Puerto Rico is in this table right here, in this conference room, because you are the ones that are you're not developing leaders, you're leaders already. For that reason, you're in Washington, D.C. You wouldn't have made it here if no one in Puerto Rico saw something in you that brought you here. You just got to go back to Puerto Rico and not fall into the normal way of doing politics in Puerto Rico. I think that it's important for the younger folks, and everyone does have a platform, but the younger folks right now with social media have an immense platform, and it's a platform that drives economies, right? A few years ago, I gave a presentation to the upstate New York Chambers of Commerce, Latino Chambers of Commerce, and the buying power of Latinos in the United States at that time was $1.5 trillion. And if Latinos in the United States were their own economy, it would be one of the top 20 economies in the world, from the G20, actually number 14, ahead of Turkey, Argentina, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Australia. That's the buying power. And 21% of 21% of millennials in the United States are Latino. The markets have come up with a name for them. They're called Hispanials. And they know that the Latino students spend money. And through social media, young people in Puerto Rico can move mountains. And they did last year with, about a year and a half ago, with the removal of the governor's office, of the governor from Puerto Rico. So my thing is, you guys can't fall into the normal status issue. You have to look at Puerto Rico from what's important to move Puerto Rico forward. And the status issue eventually will resolve itself, because the reality is that the resolution for the status is in the United States Congress. And until they decide, unfortunately, we're going to be stuck in the same, hamster wheel.
well, in terms of your question on advice, I think it was the right advice to current students and the audience. I think I guess not only the ones that want to create change, but just in general, it's just that importance of being aware of your privilege. That if you're having an education, if you're building up a career, ultimately you have privilege, and I think it's very important to keep grounded, keep aware of your base, and being humble, being approach this with humility, don't feel entitled. So I don't want to bring it down or sound negative, but sometimes it's that is important to keep you real, especially often when one gets degrees, etc. You're expected by yourself or by others to excel and to then of course follow dreams, but always be mindful that you didn't get there just by yourself, and that you got there because you have a community, because someone cared about it, and that you I don't know, for me it's it's a duty, and you owe back, and also it's important to think, to understand that there's nobody indispensable, yet everybody's needed, and so I think when I think of the environmental movement, actually one of the reasons that I really I was drawn to it, it's because I remember meeting once, actually when I was in studying in DC, a former guerrilla person from Uruguay, and she was very frustrated with a lot of the movements from the left in Latin America, that some of them had reached power but then had become corrupted, and then that protagonism of some of the leaders. And one thing that she told me, I remember, it was that if I would be growing up now and entering in the building up my career, and I was probably at that moment in many places where the students that are listening to us are, she said, I would dedicate myself to the environmental movement because it's a protagonist-less movement, sort of like a leader-less movement, no? And in 50 years of the current of the modern environmental movement, I think probably Greta is the only one that has become kind of like a symbol of the movement. Other than that, there's not that many faces, and that it's important for a movement to be grounded and to ensure that it moves forward without any fanatisms that we sometimes see in other places, especially in political parties. So I would say that that importance of being aware.
Thank you so much. We're going to move to our Q&A part. If you notice, if you open the Q&A, there are some questions there. Feel free to type if you want an answer, or indicate if you want to answer any of the questions live. I would like to take this opportunity now to introduce Jacob Marrero Torres, who is a Master of Public Administration student at FIU, who actually lives in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and who serves as the chair of our Intermestic Programs Committee, in which our Puerto Rican Diaspora program is staying. And he's going to be sharing an excerpt from Mayor Ferré's speech to the United Nations in 1972.
Yes, thank you, everyone. As we've already discussed today on a historical context for Puerto Rico, and Ferré gave a speech on January 31st of 2019. And he specifically said that the following: what we ask for is not liberty, which we have, but equality, which we do not all have, equality with dignity. Based on Ferré's vision and what you know now of Puerto Rican diaspora and Puerto Rico's historical context, what would you say moving forward in the future would be the future of the Puerto Rican diaspora, and reflecting upon Ferré's quote? Any member of the panelists, if you have a reflection on what.
No, could you repeat that last
Yes.
part?
So,
Because it was,
Mayor
I had
Ferré
actually a
gave a
break.
speech, right? And we grabbed a quote from his speech, and his quote was, "What we ask for is not liberty, which we have, but equality, which we do now have, equality with dignity." Do you believe that Puerto Ricans now, especially the Puerto Rican diaspora, have equality with dignity?
I'll take a stab at it. I think Hurricane Maria showed us that we do not have equality. And for a lot of us that had parents, families, and loved ones on the island, we learned very quickly that there was nothing dignified about the way we were treated and how it was handled. I would venture to say we were treated very much as second-class citizens. It was a really, really difficult time, and it opened our eyes to a lot of things that maybe were right under the surface and weren't as clear for everybody. So I would say that moving forward from that moment, certainly whatever happens in the future, whatever equality we reach for, whatever doors of opportunity we open, I very much see this as a community, civil society-led effort of us taking into our own hands the ability to exercise our voices, our votes, our power to get involved and not stand on the sidelines. And so for me, it rings true. We may have freedom, but we certainly don't have equality. And I think that is something that our community continues to work very hard towards.
So I will agree with part of what he said, but disagree with part of it respectfully. I think that we as Puerto Ricans, we have not had liberty. And the ultimate example in the 120 years, there has been a system that the sovereignty of Puerto Rico has been defined as being situated in the Congress of the United States. That is not liberty. And I think the ultimate lack of liberty is promesa and the fiscal board that basically strips the democratic appearance of democracy in Puerto Rico. It strips it in of itself. So I think I would disagree with him regarding that. And equality is something that is also very evasive, and it's evasive inside the United States as well. So I don't think that that's a problem necessarily specific to Puerto Rico. I think it's a problem that we struggle with in all democracies. And I would basically say that we do need to look at that and look at democracy. I think democracies in general today across the world, but definitely in Puerto Rico, definitely in Venezuela, definitely in the United States, are living through some really difficult times. Polarization, we've discussed earlier in the conversation, people, disinformation, people giving equal value to information that is clearly false versus because you like the way it sounds versus scientific and actual facts that are available. Just what we've lived in this country with COVID this last 2 years, you know, it's unbelievable that we would be talking about the United States of America, debating whether doctors are right or wrong, and saying that go get vaccinated. You know, it is a very difficult moment that we're living in, and I think from the right or the left, this polarization that we're seeing in democracies is forcing us away from democracy, and it's forcing leaders to take on stands and say things that are going to get them elected, and then they manipulate the legislative process or their power or their votes that they have in the legislatures in order to make it more difficult for the other party to have a say. And then that's actually a movement away from democracy and towards dictatorship, and you end up having abuse of power and corruption in every example. So there's no doubt that in a place that lacks democracy like Puerto Rico does, that there is corruption in Puerto Rico. No doubt that there's growing corruption in Florida, USA. No doubt that there is corruption in Venezuela, where you have, abuse of power and governments that are controlling their so-called democratic processes for their own specific advantage. So I think, Ferré would agree with this, is that we need to move towards a point where we can be civil again and have our differences, but partake in our democracy all together, because we are all part of it. We're all citizens. We all are part of a nation or nations.
In terms of equality as it relates to Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, I've had the blessing through work of traveling across the country and engaging with Latino communities all over the country. And Latinos from other nations always tell me Puerto Ricans are so lucky that they're United States citizens, right? And we are. I mean, I thank God that I am, at least. But I always tell them that doesn't mean we're still not treated equally, right? We're still looked down as an immigrant, as a foreigner, as someone who's coming over here to take. As the son of someone who came in the Great Migration of the 1950s and ended up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, only because there would be a pickup truck going around his hometown, every hometown in Puerto Rico. We have jobs in New York, come to New York, we have jobs in New York. They flew them to New York, put him on a bus, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, 2 hours later as a migrant worker, right? And the struggles that Puerto Ricans go through, the diaspora, in terms of the racism and the classism and the barriers that are put before us, are still the same ones that other immigrant communities in the United States experience, with the only benefit that we're United States citizens, right? But a lot of people can't. I mean, if we all get together with a whole bunch of Latinos, we could probably within ourselves pick out who are the Puerto Ricans and who are the Dominicans and who are the Argentinians, or, but when someone sees us through one set of lens, we're all, either Mexican or whatever. So on the diaspora side, and having grown up under Maurice Ferré throughout my life, there's still difficulty there that we as civic participants have to continue pushing the ball so that we get heard at an equal level.
At this point,
I don't think I have.
Okay.
What? No. Actually, I mean, I think I don't have much to add to what the other panelists have said. I think until, if we see the effects of the Jones Act, if we see Promesa, if we see the treatment after Maria, it's obvious there's not equality. So, but I think that my fellow panelists have said it all. So we can move on to the next question and try to have as much discussion as possible.
Yes, we're going to go ahead and introduce Ivana Ferré, one of our MPA student leaders, president of Pi Alpha Alpha, Public Administration's Honor Society at FIU.
Hello, panelists. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm super happy to listen to your perspectives on Puerto Rico. I do have a lot of Puerto Rican friends, not Puerto Rican myself, but it's really interesting to hear everyone's perspective. I did have a question for you all, and it's, what factors do you think is the reason why Puerto Ricans are now migrating to U.S. cities other than traditional places like Florida and New York?
I would say opportunity. In Texas, there are a lot of opportunity for folks who are in the medical field. I mean, Houston has the largest medical system in the United States, probably in the world. It was interesting. I was reading how in Arkansas, there are these huge amusement parks in the Ozarks that rely on the work of immigrants. But because of all the problems we've had with our immigration system here in the United States, they're having a hard time recruiting these folks to come and work in the service industry and the tourist industry. So Puerto Ricans are moving to Arkansas to work in these amusement parks and the like. And you know, when you're traveling down a road in Anchorage, Alaska, and you see that the car in front of you has a little Puerto Rican flag hanging from the rear mirror, you speed up and try to catch up with it, to figure it out, right? But we're all over the place, and recently with the Olympic track star that won the gold medal, the whole discussion about her being a Puerto Rican or not. What I loved about that conversation was that Puerto Ricans, we're born wherever we want, so and we go wherever we want. So I think that opportunity is what's driving people to move into other places other than New York and Florida.
I totally agree with you, William. But for the other side of the coin is lack of opportunity in Puerto Rico. I always thought I would go back to Puerto Rico one day, and every time that I've gone back to Puerto Rico, it's been with it's broken my heart to find so many, such a difficult situation for opportunities in the island. And I think that that it's not that case for everyone. Obviously, there's very successful people in Puerto Rico who've made a very good life, but the lack of opportunity in Puerto Rico is just an equal driver to the opportunities that are available throughout the 50 states.
Okay, now we have Evangeline Chin, a distinguished MPA student as well.
Hello, everyone. It was quite an interesting conversation. Glad and happy to be here with all of you. I've learned a lot about Puerto Rico. I'm not Puerto Rican, but I enjoy learning about Puerto Rico. So today my question is about cultural identity. I wanted to know, how do Puerto Ricans maintain their cultural identity even after they they migrate here to the mainland, to United States?
It seems like I've been here the longest in the United States among the group. And I was born in Puerto Rico, but at 7 months came to the United States. My parents already lived here. And it was through their sheer inculcation of their Puerto Ricanness on me that I have maintained. I grew up in Miami, lived 20 years in Washington, D.C. I've never lived in Puerto Rico. But no one would know, because I claimed Camuy, Puerto Rico first, and then I claimed Miami. That whole Puerto Rican, it's hard to break away from with your family. I mean, they drive it in you, and it's a beautiful thing.
In Hawaii, there's a community of Puerto Ricans that went there right at 1898. They were pineapple farmers that were moved from one colony to another in 1898. And those Puerto Ricans are still there, and some of them may be called Juan Chon because they married somebody who had they're mixed with Asian or whatever, but they still eat arroz con gandules. Generations, hundreds of years later, they still eat, and they call it el junte. They don't call it arroz con gandules, they call it el junte. And they also eat pasteles. It's a little bit of different variation, but it's still the same, and they call it pasteli. So they changed the name a little bit, or it changed a little bit, but the culture is so deep and it's so important. And I think it comes down to a culture of resistance, a people, a country that has never really had I mean, we talk about the liberty earlier. The liberty does not reside in Puerto Rico. The liberty resides in the Congress of the United States, by definition, of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And so people that have been stripped of their liberty, they have to hold on to the one thing that is theirs, that they can hold on to, and that's their culture and their identity. And I think that that's been one of the great gifts that Puerto Ricans have given to Latinos in the United States, is that strong and almost uncompromising commitment to preserve their culture and their heritage. And so that I'm very proud Puerto Rican. I've lived most of my life here in the United States, but I will die, with that culture and that identity in my hands, as tight as I can, never let go.
I think I would add, I mean, I'm not being an expert or a student of these topics, but having migrated and also living in different parts of the world, I think that that language had a lot to do with it. That sometimes people think like, oh, in Puerto Rico people speak both languages, and no, and especially when people started migrating here, it was also discrimination, the experience in the in the migration has a lot to also maintaining that sense, and also having such a thriving culture, some it's I mean, I think we have been for generations, and we still maintain so many aspects of the culture, even more than some of the social classes in the island, that, or at least that I noticed. And so, and also having been, I think, one of the first big migrations from Latin America has a lot to do as well, because in a way, I think the Puerto Rican diaspora was a trendsetter and sort of like led the way for a lot of the other migrations that have come afterwards. And that's beautiful. And that's, I mean, ultimately, enriches like cultures and countries. So it's great to be part of that.
I want to add a little bit onto Marco's point of that resiliency. It was up until about 1958 that having a Puerto Rican flag in Puerto Rico was illegal, both by the Puerto Rico government and the United States government. And that's why my friends always ask me, my non-Puerto Rican friends always, why do Puerto Ricans always have so many flags? One flag is not enough. It's a whole bunch of them. You've got it on your shirt, your socks, your shoes, wristbands. And it's because for a long time, we were not allowed to wave our flag, not even in our own country, right? So that resiliency and that pride continues. If you've ever been to a New York City Puerto Rican Day parade, you'll never see more Puerto Ricans and more Puerto Rican flags in your life, not even in Puerto Rico. And I think that's the standard bearer for us all, and we'll die on our flag.
This has been so interesting. I've learned so much. Makes me want to keep on learning. I had no idea about the population in Hawaii, but that's really interesting as well. And with the flag, wanted to go back to the Q&A, as we have about 15 minutes left before we conclude. Thank you, Dr. Colón, for answering so many of the questions as well. Looking at the questions, I'm going to go to the first one posted by Carissa. In the context of the protest called for this Friday against LUMA, what do panelists think about Puerto Ricans' request for this company to leave, and how PR can overcome the energy crisis they are in if LUMA leaves?
I'm going to offer up Ramon to answer this one.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can definitely, as we have, and we as Sierra Club have taken like stands around it. But I mean, you started answering some of that in the infrastructure question, Francis. But yeah, I think it's I cannot see where how the question is framed, but in terms of the oh, okay, I see it on the context of the protest. Yeah. So I mean, people should be enraged in Puerto Rico with this contract. I think and I will not get into the privatization if it's, good or bad or what was needed, which I mean, I also have opinions about. But, basically we're building, we passed through Maria, the system collapsed. And here there is an attempt to privatize the transmission and distribution system with a fraudulent contract that will basically rebuild the system as it was before. And we should have been using this opportunity to build resilience on it, to decentralize a system that it's very old-fashioned. And again, I'm not saying you have to modernize it only by privatizing. I think that that people will be very frustrated with this model because it continues being a model that it's a monopolist, that is centralized. And worse than a public monopoly is a private monopoly, because we won't get, many things will happen behind our backs. They're already raising prices, so a big part of the energy reform, what was looking for in 2014 was to make the, to lower the price of electricity in Puerto Rico. And so it is very frustrating, and everybody should be joining that. And not only about Luma, but there is actually a facility for liquefied natural gas. So it's that has been built without the federal permits in line, and that's by New Fortress Energy, bringing gas from fracking from the Appalachian, from other places, and done that in Puerto Rico, in one of the most densely populated areas of the Caribbean. You're building something that is very volatile, that it's dangerous, and also you're doing that, basically planning the next 30 years of switching to natural gas, when we should be doing the opposite. We should be learning from Hawaii, that is taking steps to build, to become energy independent and 100% renewable energy, by I think it's 2050. But we have that in the law in Puerto Rico, yet the corrupted government is doing right now, taking steps to basically, in-depth the next generation into more fossil fuels. They say that it's a transition. No, it's not. If it was 30 years ago, I believe you were transitioning. At this time, we shouldn't be building anything based on fossil fuels.
As we come to the end of our program, I just wanted to offer any final thoughts that anyone had as well, and also an opportunity to give a plug for your organizations and the work that you're doing.
I'll just add to the what I was saying before. Sierra Club has been a supporter of this initiative called Queremos Sol, to focus much more on what is more abundant in the island, that it's solar energy, but also together with that, again, microgrids, being able to decentralize the electric system. So please, do support that protest, and organizations like the Sierra Club we have a local chapter there, but there are so many other organizations that are doing great work, especially coming out of Maria. So, many people here would know about Casa Pueblo, but almost there are communities all around the island, in Mariana, in Humacao, Peñuelas, etc. They're doing great thing. El Puente, Taller Salud, so many people that are contributing. So please get involved and do something, right?
So at Alianza, we believe in leadership, and leadership in the environment, leadership in housing, leadership everywhere, in education, in every possible sector. we're very, very proud to be partners of the Sierra Club, partners of many of the organizations that work on different issues. And I would say that, you know, we all obviously care about many issues, and all of our issues are important. But there's one issue that brings us all together and impacts us all, being all children of this planet, and that is making sure that this planet continues a healthy direction, whether it's the little part over there on the island, or the little part here in Orlando, or the little part over there in Miami, but the entire planet. And it's for us a privilege and an honor to work alongside the Sierra Club and many other environmental organizations on what I think is the most important issue of our humanity, our total humanity, and that is saving this planet. So thank you, Ramon, for your leadership. We're so proud as Puerto Ricans to have you there. Congratulations also.
We'll say as I continue work with students and universities in the areas of public policy, politics, and government, I applaud what you're doing at FIU, Dr. Caraballo. Obviously, I'm biased since I'm an alum. And I know a number of FIU students that go do their DC internship in Washington, DC, and I think that's very important. Growing that civic leadership through our students is very important. We saw what happened last year through social media, what happened in Puerto Rico with social media and pushing out the governor and the frustration of the people. And here we were connecting with everybody from the United States on strategizing on how to do that. Last year, all the social movements with the Black Lives Matter movement and how everyone was involved. You know, it was an important time for anyone in the BIPOC communities. So I think that as Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, we need to continue working together and moving this ball forward, because what happens in New York has a definite effect in Orlando, in Cleveland, in Philadelphia, and other Puerto Rican communities across the United States, and start looking at what happens in Puerto Rico. I have a Dominican friend, and most of you know her, Alejandra Castillo. She says, the issues of Puerto Rico hurt me, right? And she's very dedicated to the issues of Puerto Rico, and she's Dominican. So we have to have that same passion, right, in moving forward the themes of Puerto Rico. And like I said earlier, and I saw one of the questions was, how do you get involved when it's not just on the political side? Find your passion, whether it's in housing, whether it's in the environment or animals or whatever it is. And that passion will get you to civic participation, because unfortunately, there's a political connection for everything that is done across the board. So congratulations on putting this together, Dr. Caraballo. And before we all finish, I want to say Happy Hispanic Heritage Month. And for those of you who don't know, September 23rd, 1868, we'll be celebrating the 153rd anniversary of El Grito de Lares, which is Puerto Rico's independence cry, which I always say was going to be El Grito de Camuy. That's a whole other story. But my revisionist history on that.
So I think I'll add that one of the things that I'm working on passionately with the organization I'm a part of is getting the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation package passed in Congress. And if those bills pass, particularly the reconciliation package, and we should want them to pass together, queremos los dos, it would be the largest climate legislation package in the United States history. And it is designed to get us to cut emissions at the rate at which we need to stop climate from warming above 1.5 degrees. And so it's an issue that I'm very passionate about, and that we should all want our representatives and senators to vote in favor of. It contains all of the pieces of legislation that would give us incentives for electric vehicles, that would allow us to send renewable energy through the grids to your homes. And so I'm really passionate about that process. Keep your eyes on it. urge your representatives to vote in favor of these two packages in tandem. We are headed to the climate negotiations in November, and I want the United States to show up after 4 years of absence from the climate change table.
Yes.
Show up with a great presentation card of how we voted to make climate legislation a reality in this country and to tend to this climate crisis. And so that would be for the organization I work for, Center for American Progress, of which Sierra is definitely a partner, and others. That would be my rallying cry for folks. But I think that just one final note, thank you to the FIU Ferré Center for Civic Engagement for hosting this. Thank you for the hard work you're putting into building this program and to being a part of our community to give these issues visibility. We are committed to supporting your work, Dr. Caraballo, and of the center, and what the center means to our community. And we want to congratulate you and to know that we are going to be a part of the success of this center.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Actually, all I can say is muchas gracias.
Well, thank you. And I would add, I mean, thanks so much for bringing that, Francis, because, you know, people should definitely, you know, look into that and call your representatives, call your senators. People, I mean, don't underestimate. Right now, I'm actually not in New York where I live. I'm in Washington, D.C. Today, many of us were risking arrest in terms of, you know, in solidarity with indigenous people. And this whole week, there are events like that. But, you know, the bills are still negotiated now. Actually, after this, I'm going to a meeting with Congress members and senators from the Progressive Caucus. And there's still, you know, again, like, please make those phone calls and don't leave it for tomorrow, you know, or next week. Those things are being discussed right now, and we need so much, you know, from what Francis was saying, and it is the coalition that Francis' organization is one of the leaders. You know, there's this climate test that we're focusing on that really needs to, you know, has like end of you know, the subsidies and the civilian climate corps and like, you know, protections and incentives to take the lead out of pipes and electric vehicles, everything. So please, definitely let your voice be heard.
For those that are in the Zoom or watching us from Facebook Live, please continue joining the conversation. The conversation has not stopped. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, whether it be in DC, whether it be in Puerto Rico or in South Florida. Dr. Frazier shared our contact information in the Zoom. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter. If you want to reach out to me directly and get to know more about the Intermistic Programs Committee, which partners with internal and external partners on relevant programming on the Puerto Rican diaspora and civic leadership, you can get in contact with me directly by text message or phone call at 202-573-9845. Please feel free to reach out, to join, to volunteer, to be part of the conversation. If you want to support us, we are here, and we're looking forward to working with you.
Thank you again, everyone. Just I want to thank our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom and just for sharing your thoughts on so many important topics. Thank you to our students who participated and engaged, and for everyone that took time out of their schedule this evening to be with us. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next installment. And please keep in touch, and thank you again for all that you do. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.
Night.